The Pentagon didn't see this coming, but it should have. This isn't just a supply chain issue. The room is dead silent. The latest intelligence report is worse than they feared. China has just banned the export of tungsten, an essential metal for high-tech weaponry. The United States defense supply chain is in crisis. Fighter jets, armor-piercing munitions, missile guidance systems, all dependent on tungsten. And now, Beijing holds the keys. This isn't just a supply chain issue. It's a direct economic strike on the U.S. military-industrial complex. And here's the real question. How did Washington let itself become this vulnerable? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how China pulled this off, why the Pentagon is scrambling for solutions, and most importantly, why this could be just the beginning of a much bigger global resource war. China didn't just pick tungsten at random. This is the world's tungsten supply. By cutting off Pentagon's ability to produce advanced weaponry just to armor-piercing ammunition, tank shells, hypersonic missile components, and even the kinetic rods used in space-based weaponry. Tungsten's unique properties, high density, extreme heat resistance, and unmatched durability make it irreplaceable. What's worse is, China controls more than 80% of the world's tungsten supply. By cutting off exports, Beijing is crippling U.S. defense contractors that manufacture next-generation weapons. The message is clear. You want to keep restricting Chinese technology? Fine. Let's see how you handle a military supply chain crisis. The question now isn't whether this will hurt U.S. weapons production. It's how quickly the damage will spread. Because without tungsten, the Pentagon's ability to produce advanced weaponry just took a massive hit. Beijing played the long game. For decades, China willingly made themselves dependent on Chinese competitors and forcing Western mines to shut down. In the 1980s, the US was a major tungsten producer. Today, it produces almost none. By 2022, China dominated the tungsten industry. A report from the U.S. Geological Survey showed that China controlled nearly 83% of all global tungsten production. Here's the brutal irony. American defense contractors willingly made themselves dependent on Chinese tungsten. Cost-cutting measures led them to source materials from Beijing because it was the cheapest option. Now that decision is coming back to haunt them. The U.S. has no domestic supply. No quick way to restart mining operations, and no immediate alternative suppliers. That leaves Washington in a desperate position, one that Beijing can now exploit. Why is the Pentagon panicking over tungsten shortages? The Pentagon's nightmare scenario? Because the damage is happening right now. Within hours of China's announcement, U.S. defense contractors were scrambling to secure remaining stockpiles. The problem? There isn't enough tungsten on the open market to replace what China supplied. The Lockheed Martin F-35, the Abrams M1A2 tank, and even Tomahawk cruise missiles all depend on tungsten components. The Pentagon's nightmare scenario? Delays in weapons production at a time when global conflicts are escalating. A 2023 RAND Corporation report warned that any disruption in tungsten supplies could cut U.S. missile production by nearly 40% within 6 months. That's not just an economic problem, it's a national security crisis. And if you think China is the only country the U.S. needs to worry about, think again. The U.S. isn't just facing a tungsten squeeze from deep financial ties with Chinese refiners. All high-purity supply, while the West is to restrict exports. Russia, the world's second-largest tungsten producer, is already under heavy U.S. sanctions, and recent trade data shows Moscow shifting more of its tungsten supply toward China and India. Meanwhile, Vietnam's tungsten industry, which accounts for nearly 5% of global production, has deep financial ties with Chinese refiners, making it unlikely to prioritize Western buyers. North Korea, sitting on some of the world's richest untapped tungsten reserves, remains under strict international sanctions. But if Beijing wanted to further tighten supply, it could broker quiet deals to absorb North Korean tungsten into its own stockpiles. The result? A global tungsten bottleneck, where China and its allies control virtually all high-purity supply, while the West is left scrambling for alternatives. With China shutting off exports, traders are already non-Chinese tungsten producers in Canada grade material suitable for military and tech. Tungsten prices on the London Metal Exchange jumped 15%, the biggest single-week spike in over a decade. Analysts at J.P. Morgan are forecasting a 40 to 50% increase by mid-year, as demand from U.S. and European defense contractors intensifies. Meanwhile, non-Chinese tungsten producers in Canada, Australia, and Portugal are seeing a sudden surge in investment, with shares of tungsten mining companies like Almonty Industries skyrocketing 38% in 1 week. But these mines, even if fully operational, won't meet demand anytime soon. Processing capacity is still overwhelmingly controlled by China, meaning even if Western countries mine tungsten, they may struggle to refine it into high-grade material suitable for military and tech applications. That reality is already pushing U.S. defense contractors into an ugly bidding war. The Pentagon isn't just competing against other governments. The electric vehicle market is hungry for tungsten-heavy battery and forcing the U.S. military to make tough choices in edge applications. The U.S. semiconductor industry alone consumes nearly 20% of global tungsten supply, and chip manufacturers can afford to outbid military suppliers. Boeing and Airbus, locked in a commercial aircraft production boom, are pouring billions into securing tungsten components for engines and landing gear. Meanwhile, the electric vehicle market is hungry for tungsten-heavy battery and motor components, with demand expected to rise 15% annually through 2030, according to Bloomberg. The problem for the Pentagon is speed. U.S. military procurement contracts move slowly, weighed down by bureaucracy, while private companies can strike immediate deals with suppliers. This means that as tungsten scarcity worsens, defense contractors could see production delays, forcing the U.S. military to make tough choices about which weapons programs take priority. Tariffs only work when there's an alternative supply chain. The same issue persists today that modern economies rely on. Refining capacity, slapping import taxes on tungsten products would do nothing except raise costs for American companies already desperate for materials. The 2018 Trump-era tariffs on Chinese metals, including tungsten, failed to revive U.S. production because there simply weren't enough domestic suppliers to step in. The same issue persists today. The U.S. produced less than 1% of the world's tungsten supply last year, and restarting domestic mining operations would take years. Even the Pentagon's Defense Production Act, which allows emergency funding for critical mineral projects, won't create an immediate solution. China's latest move proves it doesn't need tariffs or trade restrictions to pressure the U.S. It simply needs to control the minerals that modern economies rely on. China's tungsten ban isn't an isolated incident. A 2024 report from S&P Global weaponized its mineral dominance, and Washington restricted exports of gallium and germanium, two key metals used in semiconductor production, causing Western tech firms to scramble for new suppliers. Now, it's tungsten. The pattern is clear. China is leveraging its near monopoly on rare materials to push back against U.S. trade and military policies. A 2024 report from S&P Global found that China controls over 70% of global mining for 16 key rare minerals, essential for advanced manufacturing. The West is now on high alert, fearing that Beijing's next move could target rare earth elements used in everything from smartphones to nuclear reactors. If tungsten is a test run, it's a clear warning. Beijing is prepared to weaponize its mineral dominance, and Washington isn't ready for the fallout. China banned tungsten scrap imports in 2000 manufacturers by nearly a third. But But that policy could change overnight. If Beijing lifts the ban, it could vacuum up secondary tungsten supplies from the US and Europe, further tightening the market. Industry analysts at Roskill estimate that scrap tungsten recycling accounts for nearly 30% of global supply. Meaning if China re-enters this market, it could reduce available tungsten for Western manufacturers by nearly a third. This would put additional strain on an already fragile supply chain, driving up costs and forcing companies to rethink long-term sourcing strategies. If China reopens the door to scrap tungsten while keeping raw material exports locked down, it would effectively drain global reserves while ensuring Chinese manufacturers remain fully supplied. The result? The West would find itself not only short on fresh tungsten, but also struggling to recycle what little it is left. The Biden administration is scrambling to reverse competition and getting it back online. Restarting domestic production would take at least 2023. The Pentagon allocated $200 million under the Defense Production Act to restart tungsten extraction in Nevada and Colorado. But these mines won't be operational for years. The last major U.S. tungsten mine in Bishop, California, shut down in 2019 due to foreign competition, and getting it back online would require massive investment. Meanwhile, Canada and Australia, two of the West's last significant tungsten producers, are receiving record-high bids from U.S. defense contractors desperate for supply. But even with these efforts, the numbers don't add up. The U.S. imports more than 90% of its tungsten needs, and according to a 2024 report by the U.S. Geological Survey, restarting domestic production would take at least 5 to 7 years before reaching sustainable levels. The harsh reality: by the time the U.S. can produce enough tungsten independently, Beijing will have already reshaped global supply chains in its favor. Why do industry experts believe the U.S. is already too late to secure an independent tungsten supply? Industry analysts warn that securing a domestic tungsten its own supply without Beijing's cooperation. At the International Tungsten Industry Association, process tungsten at scale, meaning even if new mines open, raw materials may still need to be sent to China for processing before being usable. In 2023, China accounted for more than 90% of global tungsten refining capacity, leaving the West with virtually no way to process its own supply without Beijing's cooperation. Even Australia, which has significant tungsten deposits, still exports nearly 80% of its raw tungsten to China for refining. A 2024 report from S&P Global warned that without a $1 billion investment in domestic refining, the U.S. will remain entirely dependent on China for processed tungsten for at least the next decade. Experts at the International Tungsten Industry Association believe that without immediate breakthroughs in refining capacity, the U.S. will continue losing the tungsten war, regardless of how many mines it reopens. Tungsten is only one piece of a larger puzzle, and its export bans beyond tungsten, restrictions on gallium, germanium, and rare earth metals, all critical to semiconductor production, renewable energy, and advanced weaponry. Now, industry leaders are bracing for potential restrictions on lithium, graphite, and magnesium, three materials essential for EV batteries and aerospace manufacturing. A 2024 study by Morgan Stanley warned that if China expands its export bans beyond tungsten, global markets could see a $250 billion shock to supply chains within the next 2 years. The pattern is clear. Beijing isn't just leveraging its resource dominance, it's strategically dismantling Western supply chain security, one critical mineral at a time. And if tungsten was just the warning shot, what happens when China pulls the trigger on its rare earth monopoly? This isn't just about tungsten, it's about who controls even tighter. We're glad you're enjoying this video. The US is now facing the consequences of decades of outsourcing its critical supply chains. And the question isn't whether Washington can fix this, It's whether it can do it in time. The next battle won't be fought with bullets or missiles, but with minerals, metals, and raw materials. And right now, Beijing is winning. But what happens if China turns the screws even tighter? We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.